Well, thank you, Sanat, for that really overly generous introduction. It really is an honor to be here and to be receiving this medal. I spent about 30 years of my career in the trenches of building and sustaining a rules-based international economic system. I've spent more time than I care to admit in meetings of the G7, the G20. I chaired 167 board meetings of the International Monetary Fund. I've sat in endless international negotiations while at the World Bank, at the UN, meetings of the Financial Stability Board, the Bank for International Settlements, the OECD, and on and on and on. And having been in every international economic acronym that you can imagine, I always remind myself that the sole purpose of all of that was to define fair rules to govern global trade, financial flows, international development, and solving global challenges like climate change. And for 70 years, that international economic order delivered unprecedented prosperity to the world. But it's now under threat. For 70 years, the US was the effective guarantor of that international economic system. But its appetite to play that role has diminished. And so what I wanted to briefly discuss this evening is why that is and what we can do about it. So let me start with why. The US's diminishing willingness to guarantee the international economic order is not a recent phenomenon. It's actually something that has evolved over recent decades. And the conventional wisdom is that America is tired of the costs of international economic responsibility. My view is that it is not about the costs. My view is that the benefits of international engagement have not been shared because of a failure of domestic policies in the United States. And this is what has caused the diminished interest in internationalism. In the past, in US history, say with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal or during the Cold War, grand strategic ambitions were linked to benefit sharing at home. Today, globalization is associated with huge gains to the top 1% of the population, huge gains to the middle class in the emerging markets, particularly in China and India, who've benefited from integration in the world economy, but a hollowing out of the middle class in the advanced economies. We all know the story. Stagnant middle class incomes, declining social mobility, huge anxiety and fear for the future that people's children won't do as well as they did. It didn't have to be this way. Consider the impact of China's integration in the global economy, which has had devastating consequences for the US in terms of jobs and manufacturing in the so-called Rust Belt. Ironically, there was a program in place to deal with this. It was called the Trade Adjustment Program. It's existed for decades on the books. It's designed to help workers with training, relocation grants, wage insurance, to deal with the negative consequences of globalization. But that program was completely ineffectual because it's been chronically underfunded, and the barriers put in place to access it were impossible. Other countries that have done a better job of protecting and supporting workers through the inevitable dislocations that globalization brings have been able to sustain political support for international engagement. And so a better social contract at home will make the US more capable and powerful and internationally engaged abroad. So let me turn to what can be done. H.G. Wells, the writer, once said that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. And I think these days it feels like catastrophe is winning that race. But let me give you a sense of how I think education can fight back. Now, she would say that, wouldn't she, because she's running a university, right? But I actually think there are two very important reasons why education is part of the answer. First, we know that the benefits of globalization accrue to those who are educated. And that's mainly because of technology and what that's done to labor markets and who gets rewarded with high wages. So education will increase the number of people who can share the benefits of globalization. And second, those with more knowledge of the world are much more confident to engage in it. Now, in many ways, I think the Foreign Policy Association and the London School of Economics and Political Science are basically in the same business. Our business is giving citizens the tools to understand the world better. At the LSE, we've just launched a new strategy for the next decade. We call it Shape the World. And it has two dimensions. One, we thought really hard about how do we train this next generation to be confident world citizens, digitally fluent, with the skills to operate in a world in which automation is prevalent, and entrepreneurially confident to be able to thrive and lead change. We have a track record. We've trained 40 to 50 prime ministers and presidents around the world. So we think we can do it, but that is a key part of our strategy. Second, as probably the most global major university in the world, we have 70% of our students are non-UK, and they're completely globally representative. We want to be a place where civilized debate between conflicting views can still happen. At the LSE, we like a good argument. And we know that knowledge comes from very different perspectives, engaging with each other and not staying in their own bubble. And we have a history of people from the left, people from the right, people with completely different worldviews, capable of having an argument and yet still being able to sit down and have a meal together. And we want to sort of bring that to a global scale. We already have probably the largest public events program in the world. Everyone comes to speak at the LSE, from Gandhi to Mandela to Angelina Jolie to, Bill Gates, to everyone. And we now want to project that ability to bring those perspectives, both physically but also digitally, around the world through podcasts. We currently have about 13 million downloads of our podcast around the world. We want to grow that even more and do it in multiple languages and because I think there really is an appetite in the world for true knowledge and real debate and qualitative discussions. And I think the experience of the Foreign Policy Association confirms that. Now, those in the education business have to take the long view of things, and I think the work that the Foreign Policy Association does and that we do at the LSE will take time. But I'm confident that if we redouble our efforts, education will win the race against catastrophe. Thank you very much for this honor.